How's it going, everybody? And welcome to the 34th Legislative District Virtual Town Hall. That music was actually a change of pace. It was a nice intro for us all as well. But Happy New Year, and thank you for joining us this evening. We are less than a week from the beginning of the 2022 Washington State Legislative Session. It's obviously been a challenging year for a lot of folks, and in fact, a challenging couple of years. So your input is a critical part of this process for us to make positive change in this community. I'm Senator Joe Nguyen, and it is a privilege to have the entire 34th Legislative District delegation here with us this evening, including one of our favorite constituents, Congresswoman Jayapal, as well. I know that you are on a tight schedule, so we'll start with you before we move on to remarks from our state legislators. And we'll, with all that's happening nationally and what's going on right now, I think the biggest thing in folks' minds is Build Back Better. So thank you so much for your work on the infrastructure package. Thank you for your leadership in that space, but kind of curious to get your thoughts on what's happening now with Build Back Better.
Well, first of all, Senator Nguyen, I have to say thank you so much to you, to Representative Fitzgibbon, and to Representative Cody for being fantastic state legislators. I, of course, live in the district, so happy to be here tonight. On Build Back Better, we are, as you know, the Progressive Caucus, which I lead in the House, held the line so that we ensured that both bills passed the House together. And that was a very big feat. If the Progressive Caucus had not held the line, we would not have even gotten negotiations started between the president and Senators Manchin and Sinema. And in order to move the bill through the House, we insisted on a framework agreement that both senators agreed to and legislative text. We got that. We got a framework agreement that they both agreed to, that they committed to President Biden to support. Unfortunately, now where we are is that Senator Manchin went back on his word. And you probably saw my statement. I did not mince words after having not criticized him at all for having us reduce the package from what was originally a $6 trillion proposal to a $1.8 trillion proposal, and spending months negotiating. But unfortunately, he walked back his commitment on Fox News without even telling the president. So in my most recent conversation with the president, he has assured me that he is going to continue to push for everything that was in that framework agreement that Senator Manchin committed to him to support. And I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy. And that's why at the same time that we're pushing on the legislative track, because to be real, there isn't a way that we can get everything that's in Build Back Better done through executive action. But at the same time, we are pushing the president to also take a series of executive actions, particularly around things that can lower costs for American people and protect our climate. We think there's real executive action to be taken around fossil fuels, real executive action to be taken around prescription drug pricing, and a number of other things. So we're going through to put that proposal together right now. The president did take the first step of pausing student loan debt that's due, student loan payments that are due, but we want him to cancel at least $50,000 of student debt. And we're working very hard with the White House now to get him to that place and leading that effort. I'm leading that effort with Senator Warren in the Senate. So we're pushing hard, but right now the focus for the next 2 weeks is on voting rights and in the Senate. And so the Senate is going to take up hopefully a change to the filibuster that would essentially be a talking filibuster that would allow the voting rights bill to proceed and actually move to the floor. And hopefully we can get that passed. It is so incredibly important. And then the focus then will go right back to Build Back Better. And Senator Schumer has said that he intends to put it on the floor for a vote one way or another. But I am still working very hard to make sure we get at least the framework agreement part of Build Back Better, which is 90% of the bill that the House passed.
Yeah, no, and that's fantastic given the scope of everything that's happening. Can you give a few examples of how that would impact folks in Washington State specifically?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much good stuff. There's universal preschool for all 3 and 4-year-olds in Washington State. That would expand access to free, high quality preschool for more than 6 million kids across America. There's affordable, high-quality childcare where no family would have to pay more than 7% of their income. That's around 20 million kids nationwide and would have a major impact in Washington, where we rank as the 9th least affordable state for childcare. Our state's average cost adds up to about 20% of median family income. So childcare currently costs our families in Washington nearly $8,000 more per year than in-state tuition at our public colleges. We also have home and community-based care, which would impact hundreds of thousands of seniors and people with disabilities, and it would allow people to stay in their homes and their communities by strengthening an existing program through Medicaid and ending the backlog that's about 800,000 people for home and community-based care, while at the same time improving working conditions for home care workers so they make at least $15 an hour. There's also historic climate action, something that's so important to our state that you all have been champions on and leaders on in the state legislature, but it would include clean energy tax credits, investment in climate resilience to address extreme weather. It would establish a really fabulous civilian climate corps, and it would have incentives and investments for clean energy technology and clean energy procurements to provide incentives for government to purchase next generation technologies that our state is ready to lead on. It also has Medicare covering hearing benefits, but I want to be clear that this is something that Senator Manchin did not agree to, that we have been pushing for. It's one of the most popular parts of the package is all of the Medicare expansion pieces. It originally was dental, vision, and hearing, but in the current bill, it's just hearing benefits. And then a big deal for our state, Joe, would be affordable housing. Build Back Better includes $150 billion for building, preserving, and improving more than 1 million affordable rental and single-family homes, including public housing. There's a lot more: education, workforce development, raising the maximum Pell Grant, and a number of other things around HBCUs, investing in workforce development. There's quite a lot in the bill, but all of it would help create the kind of resilient, supported community that that we have been working so hard together to create in our state.
No, wonderful. I mean, it's tremendous amount of effort being put behind it as well. We're here to help in any way possible. And selfishly, as a parent with 3 kids, I can tell you firsthand that childcare cost is very expensive. So I think that condition alone would be very, very transformative for families that are here locally as well. But thank you so much for the opportunity in joining us today. Thank you so much for the time and the work that you are doing. Do let us know how we can help at the state level. A lot of that works very well with the stuff that we're doing within Washington State, and being able to augment that would be tremendous for our constituents as well. So I appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you all so much. And please don't forget that the state has a lot of money at its disposal because of the American Rescue Plan and because of the infrastructure bill. So just know that we are doing everything we can to support your fantastic efforts in the legislature. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Perfect. And then with that, we'll move on to our next segment with our state legislators as well. We'll do a quick intro of each member, and then we'll talk quickly about some of our priorities or what we expect for this next session, and then we'll go to a Q&A. And as tradition, I'll go first as senator. I'm Joe Nguyen, state senator here in the 34th legislative district, which is going to shift a little bit with how these redistricting maps are going to shake up. But it is an honor to be able to serve the community here. I think in 2022, we'll see a continuation of a lot of work that has been done over the past few years, really to try and address the persistent inequities that this pandemic truly has exposed. But first and foremost, obviously, it's going to be continuing the work done to address the pandemic and COVID-19 as well. So allocating funding for resources such as access for vaccination and boosters, even addressing, say, for instance, educational gaps that we may have, whether it's hiring nurses or counselors or psychologists within our schools to help our young people as they transition back, and even putting more money towards community grant programs for those who are more impacted by the pandemic as well. I know in the governor's package and within the legislature, there is an interest as we continue to support our efforts to address climate change. I'll leave that for Representative Fitzgibbon, obviously, since you are the chair of that committee. And like the Congresswoman said, there's going to be funding associated with housing and affordability. Homelessness obviously is a key issue that we've faced as a community that we are going to be tackling head on over the next year. And it'll be important for us to address that directly as well. And near and dear to a lot of our hearts is going to be a transportation package in Washington State that is currently being negotiated. We're still working through what the logistics looks like for that, but obviously it has implications for us here in West Seattle with the bridge being out. Also with the ferries as well. We know that we have issues with our ferry systems right now. We've historically underinvested in that space. So being able to allocate money to be able to address some of the infrastructure concerns, but also to work with the workforce development issues would be a key thing that we'll be addressing here for this next legislative session. So again, I'll hand it off to Representative Cody for your quick intro.
Hi, everybody, and Happy New Year. I'm Eileen Cody and have been representing West Seattle parts of it. Was originally the 11th when I got elected, and now the 34th. And now with the new redistricting maps, we're taking back some of what I represented 20 some years ago. Anyhow, Joe is right. We're gonna hit the road running, especially because it's a short session, and even though we accomplished a lot last year, we've got a lot more to accomplish, and COVID is still here with us. The issues on workforce, especially in healthcare, are really hitting us hard. Between the burnout for people that have been working so hard over the last 2 years to keep everyone alive in the hospitals, we have seen a huge exodus. Anybody that could retire has. And not only we see that in healthcare, but we also saw it in the ferry system. And I know that we'll probably hear from people tonight about the ferry system because of all the problems we've been having. But definitely we're going to be looking at workforce issues and trying to figure out what we can do to help people get back into the workforce.
Great. I am Joe Fitzgibbon. I am your other state representative, and I live in Highland Park. And as Joe Nguyen mentioned, I chair the Environment and Energy Committee in the House. So a lot of my work centers around making sure that we have a healthy environment for current and future Washingtonians. The biggest part of that work in the last couple of years has been work to fight climate change. And we really have had a very remarkable 3 sessions in a row, 3 years in a row on the climate action front, including legislation by Joe Nguyen to adopt strong zero emission vehicle requirement in 2020, making sure that Washingtonians will have access to electric cars at a greater level than we did in the past. And so that is one of a series of really important landmark climate bills. In 2019, we passed laws moving to 100% clean electricity, adopting the nation's first commercial building performance standard. Then in 2020, the zero emission vehicle bill I mentioned. And then just this year, we passed a clean fuel standard, which is a law that I've been working on for many years. Many of you have heard me talk about that in the past. We were finally able to get that one through, as well as the Climate Commitment Act, which makes Washington only the second state in the country with an economy-wide cap on greenhouse gas pollution. So all really important stuff. We are not anywhere close to done. I wish we were closer to done on the climate fight, but it is a big enough fight that we are going to have to be doing hard work on that issue year after year. A lot of the work we have to do on that front this year is kind of, I think of sort of as like eat your broccoli kind of legislation, because the law that particularly the Climate Commitment Act that we passed this year, there's a lot of loose ends, things that need to be clarified, things that need to be tied up, unintended consequences that we have to just fix. And so some of that is the work ahead for me this year, but as well as we have more work to do to reduce emissions from buildings, particularly from heating, space heating and water heating in buildings. We have some exciting bills, including one to reduce methane emissions from landfills. That's one of the most cost-effective ways for us to reduce greenhouse gas pollution in the short term. Obviously, there's a lot more to do. There's a law that I'm working on to get more toxic chemicals out of clothing. And it's particularly children who are most impacted by the kind of toxic chemicals that we're trying to remove from the clothing, as well as from firefighting equipment. So our first responders who are putting themselves in harm's way to keep us safe from fires and other public safety risks are not themselves harmed by the clothes that they're required to wear. We passed a great environmental justice law in 2019 requiring that the state really take into account disproportionate impacts on communities that are historically overburdened by pollution when making major decisions. That's something that we really hope other states will also look to and learn from. And then probably the last thing on the environment front, where we have a lot more exciting work to do to get to use less plastics. We passed a good law, a good start in 2021, but I think there's a whole lot more to do to make sure that the plastics that we are using are recyclable and are recycled, made from recycled materials, so we can fully close that loop, as well as moving away from plastics and single-use products to more reusable or compostable materials whenever we can. I don't have to repeat what you already heard about. Obviously, the ferry system and the healthcare system are both really impacted by a labor shortage right now. We've heard from a ton of you about that. There's probably not really any part of our economy that isn't impacted by a labor shortage right now. I know that K-12 education is feeling it. I know that the port and the movement of freight and even down to your local restaurants, your local stores are all feeling this workforce shortage right now. So that's an area that we have a ton of work to do, and that we really need to invest in making sure that we have the workforce trained to do jobs like crewing our ferries and keeping people safe in healthcare settings into the future. That's not the kind of thing that we can really solve in one session. That's going to be, again, year after year of work. So those are a couple of the things on our mind. I'm sure there's a lot more issues that you are hoping to hear from us about tonight. So thank you for taking some time out of your evening to chat with us.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm seeing questions come in. We had some initially as well. So for those folks viewing right now, feel free to leave a question in the comments, and we'll try to address them over the next few minutes as well. But we'll go ahead and just dive right in. I think one of the first questions that we had was pretty generic. Anybody can answer this, but what does the legislature look like for next year? Are we going to be remote or in person? I can take a quick stab, at least from the Senate side. Initially, the Senate side, we were planning on doing, at the very least, in-person voting and some activities in person, but with the rise of this new variant, I think we're going to shut that down. So we're going to have remote testimony like we had last year, and likely we're going to have remote voting for at least the foreseeable future until this variant becomes under control as well, which I think is actually a positive thing. We had record numbers of people participate in the legislative process last year because they had more accessible means of doing it by being able to just dial in. So that likely will be happening again. So if other representatives would want to address that, but that's kind of the key thing for us.
The House will be going remotely and evaluating and reevaluating every 2 weeks. If we see the numbers go down as quickly as they went up, then we might be able to be in person, or at least partially in person, later on in the session. Yeah,
same. So as a reminder, please get vaccinated and get boosted. Wear mask, socially distance. We've come a long way, and there's some more to go as well. So hopefully we can put this behind us as quickly as possible. The next question that we have we hinted earlier is about the ferry system in terms of the shortages that we're having with staff and with routes. Just wanted to pose that to the group. I do know that in the governor's proposal, he has proposed about $370 million to fund constructions of new vessels and supporting the workforce. We, as ferry legislators, had initially asked for about, I think, $350 for just operating expenses, but also a significant amount, $4.9 billion or so over the next 16 years to replace aging vessels. But it is a much more complex problem simply than just funding for new vessels. It's the shortages of the workforce and whatnot. And we've been meeting over the past interim around this space to see how we can address it as well. I think one of the hardest parts was that oftentimes it was only the ferry legislators who cared about this system. And I think right now we're seeing such a dire need that other folks are jumping in as well. So that is on the forefront when it comes to transportation for next year.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything from Joe there. And, the biggest constraint on the ferry system for most of the last 10, 20 years has been the aging boats. And that is still a huge constraint. We often had boats go out of service because something broke in the boiler room, something, a propeller was damaged, or there was a collision with the dock, something like that, which is always extremely disruptive to the whole, because there's only about 20 boats in the whole system, and so one goes out of service, there's a cascading effect across all the routes in the system. Right now, that problem is still there, but now we have this even bigger problem of not enough crew. And that, I think a lot of folks thought that was related to the requirement that the state employees get vaccinated, but it seems that it's just kind of happening all across the economy, is that people are leaving the workforce more quickly than they did before the pandemic, and that has really impacted the ferry system, in part because it takes a long time to become certified to be a mariner. I don't mean a baseball player. I mean a crew on a ferry ship, right? It takes a long time to go through that Coast Guard certification. It's required for those crew. And so, when you have an unexpectedly large number of people leave that workforce, it takes a while to train the new folks to come back on. So it has been, we are very frustrated. I tell you, when we hear about, I know that the South End ferry off Vashon was canceled. I think it was a Christmas Eve. It was like at a really, really terrible time. We know that our Vashon constituents are frustrated about it. We're frustrated about it. We communicate that frustration to the governor quite regularly, and I think he's frustrated too. But it's gonna take a dollar investment as well as some patience in order to get the new crew trained that we're going to need to keep the ferry system, or to make the ferry system actually serve the communities that count on it.
Perfect. The next question that I'm seeing is on the Washington Cares. Obviously, that was a hot topic for us over the interim. So I think Rep. Cody probably be the best person to address that.
Yes, and we will have two bills that will be addressing some of the biggest complaints about the Long-Term Care Act. Just to refresh everybody's memory, that this is a bill that was actually passed in 2019, and we had several years of before it would be implemented. So it was January of this year, just this last week, that it was supposed to go into effect, where there would be, out of your paycheck, there would be an hourly of 0.58%. I think I got that right, 0.58%, 0.058. I'll get it. But we put that on hold, and the governor put it out that we were going to put it on hold because there were so many concerns raised when more people realized that what we had implemented or what we were going to do. I will remind everybody that the reason that we passed the bill in the first place is because of the cost of long-term care. Most of the long-term care insurance companies we've had several of them go under. They are also screen a lot of people out and don't actually offer insurance to everyone. It is very expensive. So it has turned out that not the people that need it the most oftentimes are not who get it. And so we had studied the long-term care problem for several years before the bill was passed. And we were able to, with AARP was very involved in it, actually, in supporting it and pushing it through because of the concern of being able to take care of our disabled and our elderly. And also, I will just add, for those that don't know, 70% of the nursing home clientele, the state pays for. They're on Medicaid. State and the federal government pay for. So we're either going to pay for it now or later. Long-term care is not something that we are going to avoid. So that was what passed the bill. The changes that we're going to make are some of the things that you probably all have heard about, the complaints of the people that don't live in Washington state, but live in another state like Oregon or Idaho, but work in the state. So we're going to have an exemption for those people, an exemption for the military spouses that are here just because of this, that being stationed in Washington. They will be allowed, they can decide for themselves if they want to be in or out. And also the visas, the foreign workers that are here that are not even citizens and that would not be staying here. So those will all be allowed to have exemptions. And then the second bill will have the timeline pushed out for 18 months before we start having the tax implemented, which will give us another session if there's other things that we need. Well, there are some things that we're going to be studying to see if we need to make other changes. And for the near retirees, those people that would not get the time invested, we're going to have a prorated. So if you work 3 years and leave the workforce and pay in for 3 years, then you'll get 30% of the benefits. So those are the changes that we're going to be making, and those will be tried to get through as quickly as possible at the beginning of the session, because there's been so much confusion about the taxing.
Thank you so much. Obviously, a very important issue, very complex issue that we're trying to work through as well. So I appreciate everybody's patience. We've had a number of folks reach out on that subject, and we are certainly listening and engaged as well. Kind of the next set of questions kind of deal with affordable housing in general, more on the investments in that space, but also on some of the density issues as well. Fitzgibbon, I know that you worked a lot on this space, especially on the density side. Curious if you had any feedback in terms of affordable housing, but also what can we do in that space?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, it's great. It's a great question, and it's one of those issues that there's not going to be a single solution to. We've got to do a whole bunch of different things at once. So one of the things that the federal government and Representative Jayapal deserves a ton of the credit for this. The federal government made sure that there was lots of rental assistance available to people whose livelihoods were impacted by COVID-19. It's been kind of a slow process getting those dollars out to people to put it to work, but I think we're finally moving toward, have worked out some of the kinks in that system. But ultimately, the problem in our region is that we have a housing shortage. We've had a lot of people move to this area because there's a lot of job opportunities here relative to a lot of parts of the country. And the housing supply just has not kept pace with the number of people moving here. And that's why you see more and more people priced out of the neighborhoods that they lived in for a long time, maybe the neighborhoods they grew up in, and forced to move to places, where they might have to commute, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours to get to work every day. And we don't want that to be the solution, because that means longer commutes, less time with family, more expensive gas bills, obviously more pollution. We want there to be enough homes, in proximity to where you work, that you can live near where you work and keep your valuable time and valuable, money, going to things other than a long commute. So part of how we have to do that is we have to accommodate more housing. And we have to accommodate that housing in places where the infrastructure exists to support those houses. So I got a bill passed in 2019, which I was pretty proud of, that has basically provided grants to local governments that took actions to allow more homes in their jurisdiction in all different kinds of ways. If you made it easier to build housing, to build apartments near a light rail station, you were eligible for a grant. If you made it easier to put duplexes on a corner lot, you were eligible for a grant. And so we actually saw, I wasn't sure how many cities would take us up on that. A lot of cities, including cities that have historically been, places like Bellevue, that have historically been really resistant to allowing more homes, did take some of those actions. The governor's proposed a bill this year, which I know is going to be controversial, but I think is necessary and overdue, to legalize more types of homes in more neighborhoods. And so essentially to allow homes like duplexes and triplexes in areas that don't currently allow them. I don't think that's a silver bullet either. I don't think that's going to, overnight make housing affordable for everybody in the state. But I do think that is one of the ways that we can stop the spiraling increases in rent, and hopefully make housing prices and rents, be more affordable in the long term. So yeah, there's a lot more I think that we have to do there, but we don't want to pave over our farmland. We don't want to pave over our forest lands and our wetlands and our important natural areas that are habitat for wildlife. And we don't want people having to commute 2 hours to get to work. So to me, what that means is we need to make better use of our existing urban areas and make sure that the natural spaces, even within our urban areas, like wetlands and steep slopes, are tree canopy, are also valued and are not harmed by the move to accommodate more homes in places where that infrastructure is in place. So it's a big challenging issue, but it's probably the single. when we look at how inflation has impacted people, which is here and experience that, certainly I think all of us experience that. For almost all families, their number one cost is the cost of housing, whether that's your mortgage, whether that's rent. The number one household expense is the cost of housing. So the single best thing we can do to reduce the harms that inflation causes to family budgets is to enable people to afford a place to live at a lower share of their income.
No, fantastic. And kind of you hinted at it a little bit. I think the intersection between affordable housing and public transit and even economic opportunity is very clear. And we have to work in tandem for that to be able to address kind of the needs that we have in our system. I see that there is a question about just investments in public infrastructure as well to help carry more people and get them off of the roads. That's certainly on the forefront of our minds as we work through a transportation package this very next year. I know that that is a key priority for a lot of legislators, especially us in the 34th who need it for some of the investments that we have in this particular area as well. But a significant chunk is for public transit and multimodal options. In fact, talking to advocates about how that can be expanded as well. So for the questions about public transit, I think you got some of the more, Representative Fitzgibbon's, I've offered to give him rides home multiple times and he just takes the bus. That's like his go-to. So I know that he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk as well. And then here, there are a couple of other questions. There's a couple of questions actually, as it relates to redistricting and the Voting Rights Act as well. So I think Rep. Fitzgibbons, you may be the best person for that, but just what's going on with that? How does that affect the 34th legislative district? And also one question about potentially an ongoing lawsuit with the Washington Voters' Rights Act, if there's any legislation that might need to be considered for it. That's not necessarily within the legislative realm, but we can at the very least kind of talk about it real quick.
I will do my best. I cannot speak to the specifics of the lawsuit that's being contemplated. I can tell you what we've done in the past. What the legislature has done in the past in adopting the Washington Voting Rights Act is say that local governments have to also take into account communities that are underrepresented, and particularly in places where there's racially polarized voting. And the places this is by far the biggest problem in Washington is in central Washington, so Yakima and the Tri-Cities area, which are majority. Most of those communities are majority Latino, but for many years did not elect any Latinos to their city councils, to their county commissioners boards, to their school boards, because they were doing district-wide or city-wide voting rather than or county-wide or citywide rather than having districted elections. As a result of that law that we passed, I think in maybe 2018, something like that, we've seen a lot of changes in those local governments in places like Pasco and Yakima that now have school boards and city councils that look a whole lot more like the populations of those communities. So that's progress. There's no question that there's still challenges, particularly in these parts of the state where racially polarized voting is so strong. I'll say that one thing that I am happy about in the map that was adopted by the Redistricting Commission is that we have a legislative district that is mostly in the Yakima Valley, but parts of it are in the Tri-Cities and in Grant County that is not just majority Latino, but majority citizen voting age population Latino. So whereas in the past we said, oh, it's a majority minority district, isn't that great? A lot of the people who were counting towards majority minority were under 18 or were not US citizens. And so it didn't it didn't actually mean that the Latino community was likely to be able to elect somebody from their community. But the newly adopted district, which and the courts will still have to decide if this is the map that under which legislators are running for election in 2022, has a majority citizen voting age population of Latinos, which is huge progress for that part of the state, and hopefully for fair representation in that part of the state.
On this. And then the next few questions, they're somewhat healthcare related. So I'm going to ask a couple of them. One from Sandra Gray, actually, about how mental health care needs in our schools. How do we have more trained and effective adults in the buildings like counselors and nurses? I saw some of the proposals in the budget, but I'd be happy to defer to Representative Cody.
Well, you're right. Definitely the governor's budget and the I know there's request legislation from OSPI, the superintendent, to try and make sure that we get more money into the schools specifically for counselors and nurses, healthcare providers. One of the problems that we have faced is that nurses and the counselors are considered classified, so that when the money comes out from the state, it goes to the schools, and then the school gets to decide how it's spent within the different arenas. And since the teachers are classified also, reducing school or classroom size has fought against having a healthcare provider. And so oftentimes the mental health and the nurses have been not the priority for the school district, and that's been the problem. So I believe, I have not seen the legislation yet, but from what I've been told is that what's coming out of the insurance commissioners, or not insurance, the OSPI is will divide out the nurses and the counselors and the health care providers so that they won't be pitted against the teachers all the time in the finances. So I'm not sure how it's going to work, but I'm hoping that that's the direction. And so we'll be anxious to see how has proposed to do that.
No, fantastic. And then there was more of a high level question: is there any hope by Andrew Nepstad, any hope for progressive healthcare reform in our communities? I think you've answered this question a number of times, so happy to defer to you again.
Okay. Well, of course, I could always debate about what the question about progressive is. But actually, I don't expect us this year to really do much about the healthcare system as probably what he's referring to. We're really focusing, as I said earlier, on trying to look at the workforce, making sure that we're going to get more people getting trained as, specifically in nursing. And making sure that we take care of the nurses that we do have. As I said earlier, that so many have retired just because of COVID and the strain that they've been under. But that I'm just trying to think what other things that we're looking at a few things that are just tweaks, I would say at this point. But we passed some major legislation with Cascade Care and updated it last year. And some of the requirements that have kept it from being wasn't as successful as we had hoped. But next year, if all of the hospitals will have to participate, so that will make a difference, so that Cascade Care will be available across the whole state instead of just select counties as it is now. So I think we're kind of waiting to see the implementation of that and see how it goes.
Perfect. And then I'm just seeing what other questions are potentially coming in as well. And then one, Michelle Meeker, Rep. Cody's a champion for mental health. It's not a question, but that is a very valid statement. So, so much for that. Here's actually an interesting one from Spencer Nielsen, which we don't actually get very often, in terms of what is something that we're very personally excited about within this next year, within the budget itself, and what's one item that you might be disappointed if it were to be cut? Here, I'll go first just because I had a chance to take a look at this earlier. But I think, at least for me, one of the reasons why I ran for office was to really address systemic inequities that have persisted over the history of our state and in the nation. And the governor actually has proposed about $125 million for a community fund for those who've been impacted by, say, for instance, the failed war on drugs or a racist legal system, and using that to help invest in those communities and help build wealth for those who've been impacted as well. That's a very unique thing that I'm not sure exists quite in other places. I would imagine it's similar to participatory budget making, so I'm kind of curious to learn more about it as well. But that's something that I'm excited about to see, because it shows where we want to put our money and make our investments. I've also done a lot of work on basic needs programs and trying to alleviate the root causes of poverty in the first place. So if those items were cut, I'd be, first off, very upset, but also very disappointed, because we made historic investments in that space that I think will help thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Washingtonians in the coming years as well.
I'll
No,
just.
go
ahead, Joe.
Okay. Yeah, I think we could either answer this as things that were in the budget that we passed last April, or things that the governor has proposed for the next budget. So I'll take the second. I'll pretend it's the second one that you're asking, Spencer. The governor's proposed a lot of expenditures to be paid for by the Climate Commitment Act, which we worked so hard to pass in 2021, that I'm really excited about, including $45 million to fund safe routes to school and bicycle and pedestrian safety grants. We know, one of the first things I worked on, in politics was in 2009, trying to fund better bike and pedestrian routes in Burien, where I grew up and lived at the time. And we didn't get it that year. We lost at the ballot box in 2009, but there were specific schools in Burien that still have really dangerous bike and pedestrian access as a result of just inadequate bike lanes, inadequate unsafe sidewalks, and particularly during these winter months when when a lot of kids are walking and biking to school in the dark. That's extra important. So I'm really excited to see those funds be proposed. There's other bike and pedestrian safety proposals in there, but the safe routes to school I know is particularly, I think, exciting to me, as well as funding for our transit agencies. Right, I know that we've talked a little bit and gotten questions already about how important transit is in our communities. It is absolutely critical, especially given the unique transportation challenges that we face with the West Seattle Bridge being closed. It will be open middle part of this year. We're very, very happy to see that on the horizon, but we need better transit service in our communities. And there are a lot of rural parts of our state where service is way, way, way lower quality than it is here in the 34th, including Vashon, actually. So I'm excited to see a lot of proposals from the governor to invest that Climate Commitment Act money in expanding transportation choices in both forms of transit and bike and pedestrian safety.
And well, I guess I'll say, going back to mental health, because we are having another, the workforce shortage is not just the nurses in the hospitals, also the behavioral health providers throughout the state. And their ask has been that we would do a 7% Medicaid increase. The governor's budget put in 4.5%. So I'm glad to see the 4.5, but I'm hoping that we'll get to the 7. So I guess that's one of the things I would say. And there's other investments in behavioral health that we are going to be making and need to make. As people probably know, we passed the legislation last year to implement the 988, which is going to be the mental health equivalent to 911, and that we're working on that implementation. And that's going to take, to be able to have a very successful system, that we have to really build a system from the ground up. And we're making progress on that, but it's slow. And so we definitely need to be putting money in that direction too.
That's actually really important on the 988. I think most folks may not necessarily realize that that's being rolled out now, but being able to have a dedicated non-law enforcement number, I guess you can call it, in order for us to address mental health crisis is going to be a game changer for our state that I think is going to be rolling out in the various jurisdictions as well. And then Michelle Mabel had a question about just the lack of low-income housing and how can cities partner with the state to help fund it. I think Rep. Fitzgibbon, you kind of touched upon that earlier as well, but there is the low-income housing. We have the Housing Trust Fund that is utilized as basically a grant program for projects throughout the entire state. And that's one of the ways historically had been underinvested until the past few years that we're putting back more funding for it as well. And that's largely how funds are distributed. So that's kind of one of the key ways to do it. I think it's a combination of funding, it's a combination of ability to have density, and then being able to ensure that we do it in a strategic way. So kind of touching upon that one, unless you had anything else to add, Rep. Fitzgibbons.
Nope, I think you nailed it.
Yeah, perfect. And then we had a question that was emailed in. What can be done to address our legal, this is kind of a specific one, legal financial obligations and sentencing reform to fix our broken incarceration system? So That's a big question. There is a sentencing task force that is in that space, and we're very lucky to have Representative Tara Simmons, the first formerly incarcerated individual to be elected to office, for sure in Washington State, maybe in the entire United States, potentially as well. And she has done a lot of work on that space. So that is a key issue that we are addressing right now for a variety of reasons. A lot of that came into place when our legal system was not necessarily meant to help rehabilitate so much as punish, and we're trying to move away from that model. But yeah, we can spend some time talking about that. But certainly there are efforts in place, largely in the Human Services Reentry Rehabilitation Committee, or also in Law and Justice. So we now have champions in that space working on these particular issues that I don't think potentially existed before, and I think you'll see that being prioritized going forward. Perfect. And then I'm trying to look at some of the other questions that were mailed in. So one's on voting rights that I don't think is going to be a thing, but there was a question about, there are some lawmakers, and I have seen their bills trying to do away with mail-in balloting. What is our risk level of moving back to a system where it's harder to participate? You guys can answer it. That's not.
No, we won't be.
It's not going to be. Yeah.
We were the first, well, second state, right? Second state in the country to be all mail-in balloting. I always have to be careful to say all mail voting. It could also mean a different thing. Yeah, no, we have a great voting system in this state. And it's, I think it's just people who are maybe trying to stir up conspiracy theories who say otherwise.
Yeah,
we have a lot of confidence in our voting system here.
Very excited about our new Secretary of State as well. Very excited to work with him. Here is a transportation question. So Washington State is funding less than half of what it needs for our traffic and public infrastructure purposes. WashDOT says funding is less than half of what it needs. Why can't the legislature take more care of basic public needs? And that's also a pretty big question in one question that I'll be happy to defer, but largely our regressive tax structure is one of the biggest problems, that we fund our transportation resources based off of a gas tax, which when we see fuel efficiency increase, which is a great thing for climate change mitigation, we also see a decrease in revenue associated with it, which means then you have regressive models that may be difficult for working families as well. So our funding model for transportation historically has just not been the most effective way of getting at it, and that's why it's been historically underfunded as well. But I'll be happy to defer to either of you as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but usually where people, when transportation and the operating budget get into it, I will just phrase it that way, is when the transportation is trying to rob things out of the operating budget that they think they can make a nexus to transportation. But for every dollar you take out of operating, that will cut another program. And so that's where the struggle goes between operating and transportation. So having always been on the operating side rather than the transportation side, I try and protect that operating budget as well as I can.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I understand the question, right? Like how can we fund transportation, in a more progressive way? I mean, I guess I'll just keep talking about the Climate Commitment Act, because I am proud of that that is about $1 billion a year in new money for the transportation system, which is not restricted to highways. Most of our transportation revenue historically, all of our gas tax revenue has to be spent on roads, which in a community like 34th, right, we have other transportation needs besides roads. We have transit, we have bike, pedestrian. We have $1 billion new a year paid for by the largest polluters in our state. And it's flexible money that we can spend on highways if we need to, ferries if we need to, or buses or bikes or electric vehicles or, freight mobility, right? So I think that's a huge step forward. The money hasn't started coming in yet because it doesn't start collections until 2023. But I think that's going to be hugely positive change for transportation in the state. And the biggest payer of that money is going to be BP. So I think that's going to be I think people will notice that as a positive change when it takes effect.
Yeah, no, great point as well, which is a new piece of legislation that's going to come in. One of the next questions that we'll have too is it's more of a federal issue, Roe v. Wade, and how that might impact us in Washington State if that were to be attacked, as we're seeing right now. What can Washington State do to make sure that women still have access to healthcare?
Well, fortunately, Washington State has been very progressive, and women's right to choose has been supported, I think, 3 times on the ballot. There's been 3 different initiatives, and so if Roe v. Wade is overturned, it's probably not going to affect the women in Washington that much, but it's going to affect women across the country in other states where the politics are a little bit more regressive. We are working on a bill this year that will update some of our statutes when it actually, this is interesting and was a surprise to me, when the first bill or first initiative was passed, nurse practitioners did not have full scope of practice. So the specific language in RCW says that only physicians can perform abortions. We did ask for a formal AG opinion. It was last year, a couple of years ago, and the AG felt that because the scope of practice was expanded after the initiative, that it is the opinion that nurse practitioners and physicians assistants can also perform abortions. But so we're going to update the language in statute this year so that there's not any argument about it. So that's one thing that we are working on. But we're very fortunate in Washington State with having really the citizens of the state supporting a women's right to choose.
Perfect. Thank you. And then we're coming up on time. I just want to say thank you to everybody, first off, for attending. Thank you to our representatives for being on the town hall as well. We're very excited to get started. Some maybe in Olympia, mostly in our living rooms and bedrooms for this next legislative session. I'll just give folks, 30 seconds or so to kind of wrap up. For me, it's an honor to be able to serve the 34th. There's a lot of work to be done still, given the tenacity of this pandemic, the persistent inequities that we keep seeing as well. We are going to be down there in Olympia fighting for your issues and making sure that your voices are heard. We are very fortunate to be in a community that supports our values and has a willingness to serve others as well. And we take that, we don't take that lightly. We want to make sure that we're properly utilizing the voices of the folks here. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I'll hand it off to Rep. Cody.
And I'll say thanks to everybody also. And just a reminder that this is a short session, so it's very intense and goes by very quickly. Try and keep in touch with us, but don't get upset if we don't answer immediately, because I will just tell you, it gets really busy on these short sessions. So, but we do want to hear from you. And so hopefully wish us luck.
I'll just say, thanks to Senator Nguyen for organizing and hosting the town hall tonight. Thanks to I know she's not with us anymore, but Representative Jayapal for fighting the good fight back east in DC. And, and thanks to all of you for letting us do this job and letting us go to work for you in Olympia session after session. It's an honor, and we're proud to get to represent you.
Perfect. Again, our contact information will be on the closing page. You can always look us up as well. We're all very diligent in trying to respond as fast as possible, but things do come fast and furious. So if you have any issues or concerns, please let us know, and we'd be happy to get back to you as well. So with that, thank you. Enjoy your evenings. For those who haven't had dinner yet, go have dinner, and we'll all see you soon.
Good night.
Good night.